Hello and welcome to Never Mind the Bar Charts with myself, Mark Pack. We're going to be talking about liberalism this time, quite literally, as that's the title of a new book from Professor Jonathan Parry about, you guessed it, liberalism. So welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Now, one thing that caught my eye about your book when I was looking at it and thinking, oh, shall I sit down and read it or not? Was there obviously many books already about liberalism in British politics and many books about the history of the Liberal Democrats and our predecessor parties, some indeed written by your good self. So what was your reason for writing this new book?
Well, I was asked to by the publishers, which is
Very
always
good
an
reason.
encouraging thing for an author, as you have a brief to write to. The book is an addition to a short series on the importance of big ideas in British political history. The idea is to introduce readers to political ideas in a proper historical context, to persuade them that ideas are not just abstractions, but were applied to politics in particular ways at particular times. And this was an appealing brief to me because I feel that sometimes historians and commentators have been a bit lazy in the way they write about political ideas. There's a tendency to separate ideas from political practice, to think that you can have a chapter on liberal thinkers and another chapter on the Liberal Party in practice, and you don't particularly need to join them up. So when people write about liberal thinkers, they tend to write about a few core texts written by people like Mill or Green or Adam Smith, but they don't really ask what impact they had on liberal legislation. Meanwhile, when historians write about the Liberal Party as a political organization, they may give quite a decent amount of attention to major pieces of legislation, but they're usually more concerned with election results and so on, because, as we all know, liberals are fascinated by the process of electoral politics, psephology, the John Curtis approach. And don't get me wrong, so am I. I love data, I love statistics. But in this book, I could afford to miss out most of that electoral, most of the organizational side to party history, because, as you say, it's been done many times before. So what I tried to do here is to see if we can define liberalism as a particular approach to the business of politics, the business of government, to identify some approaches to politics that liberal leaders have shared between them over the last 2 centuries. And if there's one overarching definition of liberalism that I'd like the book to advertise, I suppose it's that liberals have always been concerned to get the political process itself working properly, to make sure that the political system, the constitution, allows people to express their grievances, their demands effectively, and that vested interests don't obstruct the effective workings of politics, vested interests which might be landlords or political cliques or large businesses or religious bodies that have acquired too much power. So they need to be checked. And these vested interests are always with us. So liberals have always needed to focus on particular reforms and adjustments to check these concentrations of power and to increase popular confidence that the political process is fundamentally sound and will work for everyone, and that there can be a proper balance of power. So I agree with all those who say that liberalism is about freedom, but I think a more fundamental liberal value is actually an obsession, really, with fairness in the political process itself, because the freedoms that seem most important to defend within that process will change over time.
And I think one thing that quite struck me as you sort of developed those ideas through the book was how relatively few mentions there are of, say, Adam Smith. I mean, I noticed amusingly, because they're next to each other in the index, that Cyril Smith had the same number of entries in the index as Adam Smith, which says something, interesting about the book. But also John Stuart Mill has, I think it's only 5 entries in the index, or L.T. Hobhouse and T.H. Green, who I think, most accounts of liberalism in the late 19th, early 20th century give a fair amount of attention to, at least British liberalism. They both get mentioned, but only very briefly in your book. And it reminded me reading it of sort of Stephen Bush's quip that, and I think he made this quip when he was sort of driven to distraction a bit by yet another Labour politician in this case, but yet another politician, I should perhaps say, saying, well, my values are this, but I really reluctantly have to vote to do the exact opposite for whatever. And he was saying, actually, your values are revealed by what you do, not by what you say. And in that sense, it's almost like your approach is to say, well, let's talk about liberalism and define liberalism and examine liberalism through the lens of what do people who call themselves liberals as politicians, what did they actually do? And it's much more them than the text or the theory that some of them may have been familiar with, but it's much more their actions than their sort of putative reading list that gets your attention.
Yes, you're advertising it very well, very clearly, and that's very much what I'm trying to do. I began studying 19th century British history in the 1980s, and from the beginning, I was interested to uncover the arguments that politicians were using to justify the specific bills and acts and movements that they championed. I mean, my PhD thesis was about religion and religious issues, and why some people believe the Irish Protestant Church should be disestablished, and why others, also from a liberal perspective, argued that all the religions in Ireland should be funded by the state, including the Catholics, and why some liberals argued the state should teach religion in British schools, and others said, no, the state must never teach religion in schools. And I realized that there was a lot of passionate discussion of ideas behind all these bills. And if you read Hansard's coverage of parliamentary debates for the 19th century, there are all these fantastically long and polished speeches arguing these things out, much more polished and serious than a political speech today, sadly. And the same was true of periodical magazines, which wrote 30 or 40-page articles about them. So what I've done in the book, when I've mentioned Mill or T.H. Green, I've just located them within those particular debates. I've said, well, they're important because of what they said in the specific context that they were discussing it in. So I've tried to give them their fair due, but I haven't considered their posthumous life, as it were, because I think they have had posthumous lives. They've been reinterpreted subsequently, but I'm more interested in the individual contexts of the debates of the time. And I wasn't the only person doing this. I think it was partly a response to Thatcherism at the time, to the importance of ideas in politics in the 1980s. But there was a lot of other work by other people on all sorts of figures. And this same approach has since had a feed through into discussions of 20th century history as well. So it's always been second nature to me to assume that the most interesting politicians, by no means all politicians, because some politicians are always just hacks. I mean, I fully accept that, all party hacks, as Gilbert and Sullivan famously said. But the more interesting politicians do always have an intellectual hinterland, which they try to use as the foundation of their approach to what they do. And of course, then the comedy or the tragedy of politics is that they get blown off course and that by events, and they don't always succeed in doing what they think they're doing. But I think that I would say that the Liberals on the whole, well, some Liberals have remained, I think, quite alive to that tradition. I mean, Joe Grimmond was a great inspiration to a whole generation of Liberals in the 1950s and 1960s for that reason. And I think so was Paddy Ashdown later. I was very struck when I was, I think, about 16 in 1973. Des Wilson came to Dover Town Hall to speak to the local Liberals. And I was there, and he made a passionate speech about land value taxation. And it was fascinating to see the chords that it struck with the older generation in the audience. And I only realized later that, of course, Liberals used to sing an anthem about landlords and land ownership at the party assemblies.
Oh, the song is still sung at Lib Dem conferences.
Oh, excellent! Yes,
I don't go to the Glee Club myself, but I can attest that song is definitely sung.
Right.
Only a couple of conferences ago, my hotel room was just above the venue, and I can assure you, at 2 a.m. in the morning, it was being sung very loudly.
Very good.
But it's interesting, that question about what intellectual figures or or key books or other texts influence politicians in terms of what they believe. Because I was thinking about this as you were saying, as you were speaking just now, in the context, say, of John Stuart Mill, that his analogy, for example, about freedom of speech but not being free to shout fire in a theatre, is the sort of analogy that is very relevant to sort of late 20th and early 21st century politics, where the questions about freedom of speech in the context of things like terrorism has been a very live political debate. And in that sense, Mill feels a very almost practical guide for liberals as to thinking through the issues. But I think it's hard to identify examples of liberal politicians acting differently because of the influence of Mill's thoughts in the immediate decades after On Liberty came out. There are other figures who have, who publish something that has a major impact. You would think of, say, John Maynard Keynes. He clearly, did have a fairly quick impact. But in the case of Mill, I think it's quite, clearly a major figure of the 19th century, but quite hard to spot his impact on politics almost.
Yes, I very much agree. I think Mill was an inspiration for a generation of young men who went into politics, people like John Morley, Frederick Harrison. And, so in a way you can see Mill's influence more through Morley, who was, quite a major liberal figure for, well, I suppose 50 years, in fact, after the 1860s.
He wrote the huge sort of multi-volume biography, didn't he?
Of Gladstone and of Cobden, yes. And he was a, effective Secretary of State for India in the 1900s. Yes, I mean, Mill was briefly a hope for intellectuals that working men could form an alliance with themselves, a sort of alliance of brains and numbers, as they called it in the 60s. And it was really to defeat the power of money in politics, the power of plutocracy, which they got very exercised about. But if you actually look at Mill's practical contributions, I mean, the thing for which he's most famous was his attempt to get women the vote. He was very keen on women's suffrage as MP for Westminster briefly, but of course that had to wait 50 years. So yes, his practical influence was not as great as his posthumous career, which is a very lively one, which somebody ought to write about, I think.
Indeed. Although perhaps there's a parallel with Joe Grimmond there, in that I was recently looking up various electoral figures from the sort of Grimmond era for sort of helping fill out my database of opinion polls, filling in some gaps. And I was really struck, and admittedly I'm saying this post the 2024 general election, and 72 MPs and so on, but I was really struck how low the vote share and the number of MPs was, even at Grimmond's peak. And so I think it's hard to say that Grimmond had that much of an impact in terms of electoral success, but he certainly, and I think you maybe in part fall into this from what you were saying earlier, he certainly had an impact in terms of motivating a new generation of people to get involved. And in a way, a bit like with Mill, it may be that one of the big parts of their impact wasn't so much what they did themselves, but the way they inspired other people to get involved, who then did go on to do many things.
Yes, that's an interesting analogy. I certainly think Grimmond had that impact. In fact, he had it on my parents. I think that's why they became liberals in the 1950s, I suppose, not having been to university. But certainly a lot of young university types, and I think a lot of people who became young liberals were inspired, not least by Grimmond. And there's this combination which he managed to convey of sort of solid intellect, but also a sort of sense that politics should be about moral purpose, that there was more to politics than just growth. I mean, growth was important, and we needed to find ways of thinking about getting more economic growth than the rather sclerotic two parties were capable of providing on their own, because Labour was beholden to the unions and the Conservatives were beholden to business, and neither of them on their own would rectify Britain's post-war economic problems. But I think beyond that, Grimmond was always very good at articulating a sense of citizenship, about people should be more active citizens, should think about the public sphere in a way which was a sort of almost a secular religion in a way that whereas a Victorian politician would have seen it in more explicitly in religious terms. I think for Grimond, the public sphere was something that we should all respect and value and be proud of our ability to shape and influence. And I think it's that which he managed to articulate together, of course, with something much more mundane, which was that he just looked good on television. And, he had a very attractive way of, again, appearing, I think, sometimes to put the other parties in their place because they seemed a bit plodding.
Yeah, and before we talk a bit more about what your book is about, a little digression, if I may, about 1859, because this is always intrigues me, is that in the sort of top-down traditional story about the history of the Liberal Party and the Liberal Democrats, 1859 is very often presented as a key moment because it's when there's the meeting at Willis's Rooms in London that results in different factions agreeing to cooperate in a way that is usually marked as being the birth of the modern Liberal Party. And so there is a sort of conventional chronology about the history of our predecessor parties in which 1859 is a really key moment. But what always intrigues me about that is if you read accounts of British politics in the 1850s and 1860s, it doesn't feel like that 1859 coalescence was a particular major moment. There had been all sorts of various coalescences of different factions that happened prior to that, and it was by no means a rigid two-party system after that. And, were you to read a textbook with a horrible typo in it, which said that the Willis's Rooms meeting was in 1849 or 1869, it wouldn't seem that wildly out of place. It's much more. So I do just wonder, although this obviously isn't the main sort of focus of your book, but given that your book does pass through 1859, what's your thought on how important that really is as the foundation date of the modern Liberal Party?
Well, actually, I think it is an important part of my argument that 1859 was not very important. And I very much agree with what you were saying just then, that actually, if you locate yourself in the debates of the time, it didn't seem that important. So it's not that it's insignificant. There are three reasons, I think, for focusing on it. One was that, as you said, the 1859 involved reunification of a party which had been divided between the supporters of Palmerston and the supporters of Lord John Russell, who had fallen out and who had successively been prime ministers, but who disagreed about many things. The second was that it was the moment that marked Gladstone's adhesion to the party and his final movement away from the Conservatives as a Peelite. And the third was that after it, it's almost impossible to find anybody still using any word other than Liberal to describe the party, rather than names like Whig or Reformer, which had been used more before. So all these things have a certain significance, but I would say they're not that significant because Liberal had in fact been used a lot before 1859, as well as Whig and Reformer, and historians have shown it being used right back to the 1830s. And the party, as you say, was no more divided really in the 50s than it was later or earlier, because it was always slightly undisciplined, just because gentlemanly politics was quite undisciplined. You didn't really tell gentlemen how to behave once they'd been elected as an MP. And as for Gladstone, he undoubtedly brought something new to the party, but he also adapted to its existing culture. I mean, he came into the Liberals because he saw that there were powerful pre-existing liberal values that he could work with. So I think more fundamental than any of those three new things were the continuities from the 1830s. And for me, the beginning of liberal history is the 1832 Reform Act, which I see as the first major piece of liberal political reform in itself as a constitutional reform, but also because it created a two-party system in the country. And from the mid-1830s, it was not possible to be an active politician on the Reform side, the Whig side, the Liberal side, whatever you call it, without responding to grievances which are coming up from the constituencies of Liberal MPs, which are overwhelmingly in the towns and among Protestant dissenters and among Irish Roman Catholics who were allied with the Liberals. So from the mid-30s, there's an identifiable party which rests on the need to satisfy some, at least, of the grievances of those very powerful, very major groups within an increasingly industrial economy. And whether you call it Whig or Liberal, frankly, is not very important to me. But the early Liberal leaders, especially Lord John Russell, but also others like Palmerston, do have a very important place in Liberal history. And all the later developments in Liberal history make most sense when you relate it back to the 1830s and to the foundations not only of reform, but also of local government reform, of the widening of the constitution to include more, to bring nonconformists and Catholics into the party. And Gladstone himself very frequently recognised at the end of his career that he was in a party which had a long history prior to 1859.
It's interesting in that it very much fits with the theme of your book, that all of the individuals you sort of picked out there as being in some way important or influential were politicians rather than thinkers. It's maybe a little bit unfair on politicians to classify it that way, but there are people who we would know for the political posts they held rather than for their writings. And we've also trimmed a little, as it were, maybe the role of John Stuart Mill in what we've discussed. And as I mentioned earlier, Hobhouse and Green, for example, get relatively little mention in your book. So are there any thinkers, though, who maybe should be given some attention? Is there, whether it's directly through their impact or indirectly through the extent to which they particularly shape the views of the frontline politicians who do grab our attention?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I suppose it depends what you mean by thinkers, really. I mean, I suppose I would argue, Gladstone would have seen himself as a thinker. If a thinker is somebody who just confines themselves to writing, it's actually not something that Victorians didn't separate out the intellectual sphere from the political sphere as much as we now tend to do. I mentioned Morley before. Morley was, Morley wrote lots and lots of books, but he was also, a front rank liberal on the front bench for 30 years. Robert Lowe was a great intellectual. One liberal I've become interested in is the third Earl Grey, who was the son of the Prime Minister, who was too much of an intellectual really to be a great success in politics, but wrote and thought a vast amount about the British Empire. Cobden wrote a lot. James Bryce has a very good book just about to come out, I think in the autumn, by Michael Stuart Jones, who's writing a big biography of James Bryce, who again wrote lots of stuff while also being a front rank politician. So I think the curious thing about the Liberal Party actually is how conducive it was to people who wanted to combine writing and politics. Another example being Macaulay. Of course, Macaulay was in Russell's cabinet, but Russell actually made him Postmaster General because he said it will give you leisure and quiet to finish your history of England.
And indeed, of course, this is a time when senior Liberal politicians are most of the time in government. It's not as if it was you can combine being a politician and a thinker because you're in opposition and therefore don't have as much pressure on your time. Now that you put it that way, it is a surprising pattern in many ways, isn't it?
Yes, and of course Roy Jenkins, I thought, aspired to carry on that tradition, though he only discovered he was a liberal quite late in life.
Yeah. I think one other theme that comes through very clearly in the book, which surprised me in a way, was the role of local government. And I think the story you tell for the sort of early to mid 19th century onwards about how much of a focus local government was for liberal politicians, I think makes a very persuasive case that sense of dealing with vested interests, dealing with some of the worst sort of excesses of poverty, wanting to make the communities that you live in better. A lot of that got focused into activity around local government, and that's partly why the Great Reform Act is followed 3 years later by the equivalent act, as it were, for local government elections, which is actually much more radical than the Great Reform Act in terms of its impact on the local government electoral system, and how, in the decades subsequent to that, local council activity, municipal activity, is such a big part of the liberal and liberalism stories. But it's really curious then, in a way, to take a step back and to think, for all of the centrality of local government to liberal politics in the 19th century, it's not till, well, the 1970s with the community politics sort of movement in the Liberal Party, or even really the late 1980s with Paddy Ashdown becoming leader of the Lib Dems. I mean, Paddy was probably the first leader of the party or its predecessors who saw winning local government elections as part of the route to national success. Up until then, they'd been very much seen as separate things. So how is it that you've got that local government is so central to sort of liberal thought and action in the early 19th century, but winning local government elections doesn't become a large part of the party's focus until, literally a century and a half later?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, as far as the 19th century is concerned, of course, it just grows out of the existing format of politics, because local governments had more power and spent more money actually than central governments until quite late in the 19th century. So it was a natural place for politics to take place. But as far as the 20th century is concerned, and why the Liberals didn't focus on local government until, as you say, really the 1970s, that I suppose it's because the Liberals were marginalized at local level after the First World War comparatively quickly, as far as I know, in the same way that they were marginalized in national elections, that the logic of the two-party system kicked in at local level as well as at national level, probably from the 20s and 30s onwards. So, already then at local level, Tories were capturing the votes of former Liberals who were primarily concerned to keep taxes down and who didn't like what they called socialism, while Labour had this solid vote in most working class manufacturing towns. So there's very little scope for a dynamic local liberal politics in most parts of the country in the 1930s or 1950s. So thinking about it, I suppose that the local government revival of Liberals in the 60s and 70s expressed something which was actually newly attractive, because, I mean, though that they talk a bit about the continuities with Chamberlain in Birmingham in the 19th century, or T.H. Green in Oxford, or whoever, the advocates of community politics in the late 60s, like Tony Greaves and Gordon Lishman, Lawrence Freedman, and so on, I mean, they actually, I think, were quite keen to make the point that they were doing something new, even though they were very pleased to discover that they were doing the same thing that Liberals had done before. And what they were doing new was, in fact, really to capitalize on some of the things we were talking about when we talked about Joe Grimmond, that there's this sense in the 60s, really for the first time, that post-war politics, post-war Britain is going wrong. And it's largely the fault of the two main parties, that the Tories are the party of business, and business is selfish and doesn't seem to be very competent. And at local level also, there are property developers who are just lining their own pockets. Whereas Labour is sort of, I'm thinking, overly centralised state. And what Michael Meadowcroft called the soulless expanse of council house estates that had blighted many urban areas since the war. And so I think liberal local government activism in the late 60s is really a sense we can do better than this, and we can be inspired by the sorts of things that Liberals are talking about centrally to discover a new way of doing local politics. I don't know if that answers the question, but I mean, it does seem to me to be curiously both new and not new at the same time.
Indeed, and in that sense, it may also, I mean, I don't know if Gordon listens to this podcast, but if he does, he probably would have been bridling a little bit at my question, because, a big focus of community politics, and sort of he and the original founders at least conceived it, was that winning elections was a relatively small part of the picture, and there was that the ongoing then tension about pure community politics and and the version that saw it simply as a means to winning elections. I guess the other reason perhaps for local government elections not being seen as a serious, as a major part of a party's activity sort of prior to all that, was that one of the reasons winning local government elections and winning parliamentary elections became so closely entwined was because a big challenge the party faced was credibility in the eyes of the voters, and that you could win one sort of election in a way that would give you credibility for another sort of election. If you roll back to the 20s or 30s, the credibility there is the question about the standing in the public's eyes of the likes of Lloyd George and Asquith, not how many Liberal parish councillors there are in your municipality, I guess. And therefore it becomes important for winning elections when there's a problem to which it also is a solution.
Yes, no, I think that's very well put. I'm sure that's right. And of course, now you have the situation in which it's the Liberals' greatest strength. The bedrock of local support has become the thing which makes it very difficult for Liberals to be rooted out. I mean, you could see that after the coalition in a way, that the Liberals seemed once again to be at death's door. Briefly in 2015, 2017, but the way they bounce back, of all sorts of reasons, but the fundamental reason is the fact that they are a presence at local level, and that as long as that remains the case, I think they have a strength which in a way is as much in their favour as the old Labour strength in towns used to work to their favour.
The other thing that sort of struck me, almost like the other side of the coin, with the importance of local government in the 19th century and sort of thinking about how does that feed through subsequently, is the role of India in British politics, which I think your book sort of nicely brings out how big a long-running issue it was, often popping up in different ways, but it was an issue in a way that I think had obviously faded in importance, post the late 1940s, at least in British politics, but also I think faded in a way from historical memory, that it's easy to overlook what a big story India was in so much of 19th century politics. And I guess it highlights this rather uneasy legacy, maybe that's too polite a word, but of liberal attitudes towards empire and colonialism. We like to remember the bits about opposition to things like the Boer War, but actually for most of that, the 19th century, early 20th century, liberals are quite happy in many respects with empire and with colonialism, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I wanted to include quite a substantial section on empire, partly because it's a big theme now. You can't actually teach British history either in Britain and certainly not in North America unless you pay a lot of attention to empire. So it was partly for that reason, but also because there was a specific take that I got annoyed by, which is that some historians, particularly of India, have started to blame liberalism, what they call liberalism, for Britain's whole misgovernment of the empire. Caroline Elkins famously wrote a book a couple of years ago attributing imperial violence throughout the empire to this thing which she calls liberalism. Well, I won't really go into why that is, but it's, to my mind, it's fundamentally based on a lack of interest in what liberal politics was and what liberal politicians stood for. So what I wanted to do here is to argue instead, or to trace through the extent to which liberal values, as expressed in 19th century domestic politics, could affect imperial policy. And I argue that sometimes they could and sometimes they couldn't, depending on the area. So I think the best example of British liberals actually achieving something relatively successful was in Canada, where in the 1830s through to the 50s, they did actually work out a way of getting self-government to Canada while preserving the link to the crown and preventing either the French rebelling successfully or secession to America, the US. So Canada was a relative success for Liberals, and this gave Liberals more confidence that self-government as a principle could be applied to the other settler colonies. But the trouble with that was that the more power you gave to the self-governing settlers, this meant that that power could easily be grabbed by the white settlers in these places, and they could then use their democratic legitimacy from a white franchise point of view to expropriate land from the Maori in New Zealand or the Xhosa in South Africa. So liberalism becomes a bit of a two-edged sword, really, that the principle of self-government becomes a principle of white self-government in too many of the settler colonies. And as you say, then this creates one of the problems with the Boer War, that liberals are never really sure, liberals never united about what they think about South Africa, because some of them don't really approve of, some of them want to protect the natives from being exploited by the whites, particularly by the Boers. And some of them actually value the Boers because they think they are a self-governing community. And some of them, prefer the British. So the Liberals are really split three ways, and it's just an impossible question. And then after the Boer War, Asquith is handed this question of what to do about the constitution of the new South Africa. And he has to, or he feels he has to accept the idea that in the former provinces, that there should be a white-only suffrage, which to this day is a great black mark in South Africa against that government. So race, was a bit of a problem for liberals there. And then in India, you get the same issue, that only with India and with Jamaica, the problem is that the basic setup, the basic structure of imperial rule predated liberal power. It goes back to the Jamaican planters in the 17th century and the East India officials in India in the 18th century, and they've imposed this very illiberal system of government. So then when liberal governments come into power in the 19th century, what can they do about it? Well, the answer is not very much. And some of them try to tinker with it at the margins. Some of them just leave it alone because they think, what can they do? And it seems to work reasonably well. And then you get a minority of radical liberals who see very clearly that British rule in India is quite exploitative, and that economic vested interests are stripping the Indian economy of too many resources for their own benefit. And then you get this interesting trend that when the National Liberal Club is founded in the 1880s, it becomes very early on a centre for those who do take this radical critical view of British rule in India. And William Digby was one of the early secretary of the National Liberal Club, and he made Nauroji a member, and then Nauroji became a Liberal MP in the 1890s. And they both argued that the thing that native Indians needed was better representation if this policy of prioritizing economic vested interests to the detriment of Indian economic development was ever going to be tackled. So there is that perspective, but frankly, it is always a bit of a minority perspective, and most of the time, liberals had to accept the basic structure of empire, or chose to, or didn't feel they had any alternative.
Yeah. And I was quite struck because I know a very good biography of Dadabai Nauroji that came out a few years ago, which I will confess I haven't yet managed to get to on my reading list. So I don't know enough about him, as much about him as I should do, really. But so I was quite struck the way your book made me think about the extent to which he was elected as an MP in order to be a voice for Indian interests, in a way that, Scottish nationalists organising to get an MP elected for a Scottish constituency to represent Scottish, is obviously a very sort of natural part of politics. But the idea that even late in the 19th century, people would be, in that sense, wanting to get MPs elected to represent part of empire in the London Parliament is a whole sort of aspect of politics that has, since fallen away.
Yes, and as you say, I think it's taken up for India because it had a prehistory. Actually, it was particularly noticeable in relation to the settler colonies because there were lobbyists for Canada and for Australia in the British Parliament who were very powerful actually in advocating the issue of the cause of self-government for those areas. So in a way, it's a sort of liberal variant of what had preceded it, which was on the other side of the coin. Before 1832, you'd had in Parliament, you'd had a whole lobby for the slavery business in the West Indies. You had slave owners defending slavery and East Indiamen defending the East India Company, and they're swept away by the 1832 Reform Act because on the whole, they sit for rotten boroughs and they buy their way in. But the idea of interest representation, as long as the interest is legitimate, is one that liberals cling to for a long time. And as you say, in a way, it fits with the idea that in Scotland, the Scottish Liberal MPs band together and they decide what legislation they want Scotland to promote as well.
And one sort of other theme through the book, which definitely still is very resonant, is where we almost, begun this conversation around liberalism being about a sense of fair process, having the right systems to protect the wider public interest and the public against particular vested interests and powerful cliques and so on. And a large part of that is about believing in an independent judicial system, the long liberal democrat and before that liberal belief in a written constitution, having a clear separation of powers. And I just wonder, thinking about contemporary politics, if you were to look around the world and pick a country that has all of those things in a really strong form, so a really independent, powerful judiciary, a very firmly embedded written constitution and so on, it is the USA. But I think it's probably fair to say that democracy is not completely flourishing in a brilliant liberal way in the US. And I just wonder what your thoughts therefore are on to what extent those traditional liberal beliefs in certain mechanics to protect against abusive political power, how well suited still are they for the modern age, or how much might they need to evolve? Because written constitution, a very independent Supreme Court hasn't stopped Donald Trump.
Well, indeed not. And that's a very intriguing question, which I can't say I have any very good answer to. And certainly I do worry about modern technology and the ability of modern media to manipulate the truth, to distort the truth, to reinvent the truth. And of course, we have AI coming down the line. Who knows what effect that will have? So it may be that politics as we have known it becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. But with Trump, I think it's more, the issue is more that he's simply been able to bully an alarming number of judges and universities and so on into getting his way. And so I suppose the question is how successful he will carry on being. And there's a side of me, maybe it's because, I'm fundamentally, as a sort of trained political historian, I'm quite skeptical. I think in the past anyway, all politicians have had shelf lives, and what you offer in the great attraction of democracy is that actually democracies are on the whole quite skeptical and they may be taken in for a certain amount of time, but sooner or later they see something else, and so there's the natural evolution. So there's a side of me that thinks Trump will never be as powerful again as he has been in the last few months. It's the power of shock of coming in and passing all these executive orders and making all these grand gestures. And we've already seen a lot of his policies, he having to row back on the tariffs because he met with the bond market and the bond market turned out to be more powerful than he is, and so on and so forth. And so, yes, there are many twists and turns in these battles over judicial freedom. I have no idea what's going to happen.
Isn't it interesting the shifting role of financial markets both for liberals and also actually for people on the left, that, for a long time, the financial markets were seen as something, a source of unaccountable power to be suspicious or fearful of. It's obviously a big story about the Labour Party's history in 20th century Britain with devaluations and the names of Zurich and all of that sort of stuff, but also from a liberal perspective about unaccountable power. And in part, that helps explain pro-Europeanism and believing in European monetary union and a European currency to, in that sense, abolish some of the financial markets to only have the one currency. So, and yet, both with Liz Truss and with Donald Trump, in a way, the bond markets are the champions of liberal democracy, in a way, of being the reality that comes knocking on the door of a politician, however powerful they may nominally be. And that perhaps, the second edition of your book in a few years' time will have to add in that changing relationship and attitude towards the international financial markets.
Well, that is a very good point. I mean, what you're describing is the enormous power of what many people call globalism, or the financial system. And I agree that liberals have to accept the reality of it and should accept the reality of it, and that on the whole, it's like capitalism. I mean, I think all liberals should accept that they are capitalists. I mean, they may not always like to be seen as capitalists, but fundamentally, capitalism is a source of most of the world's progress over the last 250 years. The question then is how realistically you can rein in the ill effects of it. And I think the question then for all politicians is, given this enormous power of the financial markets, what can we do to make sure that that power continues to be used on the whole for good rather than for evil? And so, changing the subject slightly, but not significantly, I mean, I think one of the things that strikes me about liberals, the Liberal Party in the 20th century, is that it's always shied away from these arguments that there is any one simple economic solution to our problems. And it's saying, actually, no, both the other parties were wrong to think that there was a simple economic solution, whether it was socialism or whether it was, giving power to businesses and so on, as the Conservative Party used to argue. So, and instead liberals have said, well, actually, we need to think about politics. And so, to my mind, the most distinctive liberal economic policy has always been what I call microeconomic rather than macroeconomic, to say, well, we can't really affect the basics of the financial system. What we can do is we can show how effective politics can be in targeting taxes to achieve a particular purpose that is socially beneficial. And that was the case in 1911 with national insurance. I mean, national insurance was a liberal invention, basically to say this is an extra tax, but it's going for a particular social benefit, which we should feel proud of, that we should feel this is a bonus that the state can offer us. And then in 1992, Paddy Ashdown said, well, we'll put an extra penny on income tax for education. And it seems to me that, and again, I think they did that in 2017 with the NHS, not to such good effect. But the principle of hypothecated taxation seems to be actually quite a good liberal principle, because it shows that ultimately tax is a political tool, and that within the confines of a capitalist system, which you can't do that much about, that you can nonetheless achieve targeted benefits in those specific ways.
And I guess that may be your answer to what was going to be my final question, or maybe you can give me a supplementary answer, which was, I know you're a political historian, so you, in that sense, are used to looking at the past, but given your tour of the past that you carry out so well in the book, is there any advice for the current crop of Liberal Democrat politicians you would proffer based on what you found in thinking about and researching for your book?
Well, I suppose one great theme of the book, as we've discussed, is that politicians are better at politics than intellectuals. So I wouldn't presume to give Ed Davey much advice. And also, of course, politics is situational. So the strategy for any party has to depend really on what its opponents are doing. But thinking about politics at the moment, I mean, obviously one of the big issues is what you do about reform, the Reform Party and Farage. And the irony that strikes me is that, to an extent which is slightly uncomfortable, I think, for some liberals, he has really stolen some liberal clothes in that, reform was a liberal slogan in the 19th century. And in my telling of it, the Liberal Party began as a party that claimed to overhaul a political system that was dominated by vested interests and incompetence and get back to basics. Now, of course, Farage is not a liberal, and I'm not saying that he is in any way, shape, or form, but there is this rather alarming way in which actually he is drawing on some of the themes that liberals have drawn on in the past. And so I suppose my message, insofar as I have one, to Lib Dem politicians is that they need to show that Farage is wrong and that politics is not broken. And of course, the irony of this is that Liberal Democrats themselves used to say politics is broken all the time. But actually, the Lib Dems are making politics work at local level. And I just think maybe there should be the first thing they should do is to make a bit more of that and to say, actually, we shouldn't be as skeptical about the political system as Farage is. The political class, he's always saying the political class is separate from the people, has betrayed the people. But actually, when politics works, it works because we work in combination with the people. And so, one thing I think is desperately important is to put more money into local government so that it can be more effective in doing that. And so, if I was Ed Davey, I would try to find some more money in the manifesto to really repatriate a lot of powers to local government. And then the other point, of course, is Europe. And I don't really have any advice for politicians because I think that on the whole they're doing the right thing. That it seems to me that the great Lib Dem argument at the next election has to be that we need closer economic and political ties with Europe, fundamentally because that's the best and easiest way to get better growth. And it's precisely because we can't pull the levers of growth in the way that socialists and even some social democrats used to believe was quite an easy thing. It's precisely because growth is otherwise going to be so difficult that the single market is an obvious lever to pull, just as it was in the 60s when liberals pioneered advocating going into the EEC in the first place. So, from a liberal point of view, I think there's no downside to arguing that at the next election. And one final point, which actually goes back to what we were talking about with India, and a more difficult point, I think, for Lib Dems. I've never quite understood why it is, and I'm not sure that the party has focused enough on its own failure to reach very deeply into the ethnic minority communities of various sorts. I mean, it has done periodically, particularly after the Iraq War, but on the whole, it has not been as successful in presenting itself as a pluralist party in terms of modern racial politics in the way that it did successfully present itself as a pluralist party in religious terms in the 19th century. And so that would be, I suppose, food for thought as to what, if anything, can be done about that.
Yes, that's a very thought-provoking parallel about the way that the Labour Party, in a sense, became the equivalent relative to race to what the Liberal Party, let's call it that for convenience of shorthand, was for religion in the 19th century. And why was it that the Liberals and then the Liberal Democrats were not able to emulate more of their 19th century diversity on religion? Lots I could say on your other 2 points as well, particularly that really fascinating question about the extent to which Lib Dems should talk about politics being broken and needing to fix it, or actually defending politics and pointing to our power in local government as a we're the people who can make the system work. And I guess that those 2 points are not necessarily contradictory, because you can both talk up your ability to make it work while also saying that it needs fixing in some way. But rather than spiral off into another hours of worth of conversation, I will stick to my promise that that was my last question to you. And thank you so much for your time, Jonathan. Listeners will be able to find links in the show notes to buy Jonathan's book, which is called Liberalism. It's in the Short Histories series from Agenda Publishing. And it's only 200 pages or so, which in no way undermines the level of insight and knowledge that you can glean from it. But if anyone is a busy activist or counsellor listening, that may help encourage you to actually get the book, because it's not that long. It's a very readable 200 pages. So thank you very much for your time, Jonathan. And thank you, everyone, for listening.